Hi there. Well, welcome to part 3 of the presentation, The Case for Christ. We're going to get cracking with 3 different sets of evidence in this section. The first being the identity evidence. Was Jesus, as a man, really convinced that he was also the Son of God? Let's have a look at that in detail. There's an important thing to look at here regarding behavior and personality. And you will have heard of the term psychological profiler because John Douglas was the original psychological profiler for the FBI. You won't recognize him, but you'll recognize the film for whom he consulted Jodie Foster and the actor there regarding portraying the Hannibal Lecter, the cannibal, Hannibal the cannibal, and how they track down other criminals and victims, etc. So John Douglas had an uncanny ability to study the minds of people he had never met. He would gather information at the crime scene, then use his insight and look into the personality of the unidentified criminal at that point. And of note, if you look at one of the cases, very famous case, the Trailside Killer was a serial murderer who stalked the wood areas near San Francisco for a couple of years until 1981. And John Douglas predicted he would be someone with a speech impediment, as well as tendencies towards animal cruelty, bedwetting, and arson, just from a crime scene. And this person arrested, the person arrested and convicted in the case actually fit those descriptions perfectly. Incredible. How is Douglas able to understand the thinking process of individuals? Well, very easy. As he says, behavior reflects personality. Okay. If we want to figure out whether Jesus thought he was the Messiah or Son of God, or merely considered himself to be a rabbi or a prophet, we need to look at what he did, what he said, and how he related to others. Let's take a look at that. In this section, we're going to lean on the wisdom of Ben Witherington III, amply qualified, being an author of more than 40 books on different issues relating to Christ. So, what clues can we find out about Jesus from the way he related to others? Let's look at the disciples first. Jesus had 12 disciples, but is not himself one of the 12. He represents, if the 12 represent a renewed Israel, where does Jesus fit in? He's not just part of Israel, not part of the reformed or redeemed group. He's formed the group, just as God in the Old Testament formed his people and set up the 12 tribes of Israel. Then what about the Pharisees? Jesus makes the truly radical statement that it's not what enters a person that defiles him, but what comes out of his heart. This sets aside huge portions of the Old Testament book of Leviticus with its meticulous rules concerning purity. I think the Jewish religion has some 613 rules and rituals to be respected rigorously concerning purity. So what kind of person feels he has the authority to set aside such divinely inspired Jewish scriptures and supplant with his own teaching? And then, of course, you have the Roman authorities who placed the sign, "This is the King of the Jews," on his cross at his crucifixion. And we have to ask, why did they crucify him if he was just an innocuous sage with some meaningless, harmless little parables? How did he end up on a cross? Especially at Passover season, when no Jew wanted to see another Jew executed. There had to be a reason why this was the sign over Jesus' head. What about self-perception? Well, Jesus said, "If I, by the finger of God, cast out demons, then you will know that the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God has come upon you." Now, miracles themselves don't establish that Jesus was God. His disciples perform miracles later. What's important is how Jesus interprets his miracles. To Jesus, his miracles are a sign of the coming of the kingdom of God. It's a foretaste of what the kingdom is going to be like. This sets Jesus apart because Jesus sees his miracles as bringing about something unprecedented, which is the coming of God's dominion upon the earth. Then another thing that Jesus said, which was quite revolutionary in his time, he said, "Amen, I say to you." Now, I didn't understand this until reading Lee Strobel's book, because this was a radical new phrase at the time. What it means is effectively, I swear in advance to the truthfulness of what I'm about to say. And why was this revolutionary? Because in Judaism at the time, you needed to have the testimony of two witnesses for anything you needed to recount. So witness A could witness the truth of witness B's statement and vice versa. And yet Jesus witnesses to the truth of his own sayings. He speaks on his own authority, over and above what the Old Testament prophets had. And then, of course, he uses the term Abba. Now, Abba is like saying dad or puppy in English, daddy. And this is really revolutionary also at the time, because it brings about, it initiates a really intimate relationship with God the Father. And that was like unlike anything in Judaism in his day. In fact, it connotes an intimacy and relationship between a child and his father, which really hadn't been heard of. So there's just no messianic Jesus, there's no non-messianic Jesus to be conjured up out of the material in the other three Gospels. It's just not there anywhere. Then, of course, there's the famous interchange that he has with his apostles, and notably with Peter, when he asks, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter responds without hesitation, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," and Jesus confirms it. That was in Matthew. So church historian Jaroslav Pelikan has pointed out that the oldest Christian sermon, the oldest account of a Christian martyr, the oldest pagan report of the church, and the oldest liturgical prayer all refer to Jesus as Lord and God. This was clearly the essence of the teaching of the church at the time. So if we go through those points, we have to ask ourselves the following questions. What kind of a person forms his own group of disciples, completely undeterred by the execution of John the Baptist, who was beheaded by Herod just before Jesus starts his ministry, or as he's starting, feels he has the authority to set aside the divinely inspired Jewish scriptures and supplant them with his own teaching, sees himself as the one in whom and through whom the promises of God come to pass, considers himself to have the authority above and beyond that which the Old Testament prophets had, can change the terms of relating to God with Abba, and affirms that he is indeed the Christ, Son of the living God. Here is a man, this is what William Lane Craig says, and we'll get to him in a future section, a very, very talented debater. Here is a man who thought of himself as the Son of God in a unique sense, who claimed to act and to speak with divine authority, who held himself to be a worker of miracles, and who believed that people's eternal destiny hinged on whether or not they believed in him. In fact, so extraordinary is Jesus' assertion that inevitably the issue of his sanity has to come up. After James Dunn completed his own epic study of the issue, Dunn was compelled to state and to ask, was Jesus mad? That is a truly important question, because as we know, there have been a lot of very interesting individuals over the course of the last 40, 50 years or so, very charismatic, who actually were completely bonkers, as we're going to see. So was Jesus crazy when he claimed to be the Son of God? Well, Gary Collins is going to provide his insights in this section. Again, someone else who's amply qualified to do so. Let's get cracking. Delusional psychosis, is that what Jesus had? Because there are some very, very charismatic individuals who appear rational much of the time and yet have grandiose beliefs that they are superlative individuals. Some can even attract followers who believe they are geniuses, such as Jim Jones, who led the People's Temple movement, and some 914 people, including 276 children, to a mass murder-suicide. You all remember the David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. You may not know that in 1993, however, 74 of his heavily armed members had a massive shootout with the FBI and were killed in Waco, Texas. He thought he was the final prophet, as did Marshall Applewhite, who proclaimed himself the Messiah and predicted doomsday, leading his cult Heaven's Gate to suicide in 1997. And then there was, of course, the gas sarin attack in Tokyo with Shoko Asahara, with Aum Shinrikyo. And that was a terrible attack on people in, I believe it was Tokyo. It was. What about a cult? Was it a cult? Now, interestingly, I have been accused by, unfortunately, members of my own family of being a member of a cult when I had my conversion a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago in Medjugorje. And it was an interesting question because I took offense to this. Of course, I thought I was completely sane, and I'm still convinced that I'm completely sane. You'll be pleased to know. But then it asked me to question myself, what is a cult? Well, here is the definition. Cults are generally considered to be new, charismatic groups that espouse religious doctrine that differs from mainstream beliefs, and they have some common characteristics. Let's go through them. Members' adherence to a consensual belief system. Was that true of Jesus and his followers? I would say it would be. So yes. The maintenance of a high degree of social cohesiveness. Were they socially cohesive? Well, yes, they went everywhere together, stayed together, protected each other, got themselves out of all kinds of trouble. So yes, there was a high degree of social cohesiveness. And of course, there were the women followers who enabled them to ensure their properties and their inns were all kept and maintained, and that gifts were given out to the poor and money, etc., etc. So there was definitely a high degree of social cohesiveness. Strong behavioral mores that influence member behavior. Well, yes, there was Jesus's teachings and his standards, which he didn't really allow people to deviate from without incurring his irritation. So yes, very clearly there were behavioral mores that they adhered to. And then the recognition of members or group leaders as charismatic or divine. Well, Jesus was the leader, and yes, he was recognized as being divine, and he himself stated he was divine, which is very much like the nutters we saw in the last slide. So yes. So what do we have? Was it a cult? Yes, indeed, it was a cult. And in that case, I'm happy to say finally that I am a member of a cult. I am a Christian. What about a psychologist's view? So psychologists don't just look at what a person says, they also go much deeper and look at emotions, and they look for discomfort or inappropriate emotions at certain times, such as also getting angry and being plagued with anxiety, because there's a high amount of stress they place on themselves with their vision of themselves, and they need to prove that. So Jesus never demonstrated inappropriate emotions. He did indeed die at the death of his friend Lazarus before resurrecting him from the dead, raising him from the dead, which was natural for a healthy individual. This was his best friend. If you don't know that, Lazarus was Jesus's best friend. And yes, he did get angry at times. There was the famous instance where he overturned all the money sellers and merchants' booths in the temple because he considered they were defiling the house of God. So yes. But his behavior was quite in line with what would be expected, and he had deep and abiding relationships with people from all walks of life. He was loving, but didn't let his compassion immobilize him. He didn't have a bloated ego, even though he had so many adoring crowds. He did care deeply about people, and in a revolutionary way also encouraged the acceptance and evaluation, the respect for women and children who weren't seen as being important then at all. He also maintained balance despite having an extremely demanding lifestyle. Jesus basically never stopped after making an appearance in a town and performing miracles and reading from the scriptures and curing. He would then carry on all by foot endlessly during the time of his ministry. He responded to individuals based on where they were at and what they uniquely needed when they approached him. And finally, he was able to accept people truly for who they were, not merely winking at their sin as some kind of cult leader would. So let's see. A key comment in response to claims of madness is that Jesus wasn't just making outrageous claims about himself being God. He was backing them up with miraculous acts of compassion, like healing the blind, lame, and lepers, casting out demons, raising people from the dead, the astounding demonstrations of power over nature, such as calming storms and walking on water, feeding the 5,000 with fish and loaves, and turning water into wine at the wedding in Cana, with transcendent and unprecedented teaching and divine insights into people, and ultimately with his own resurrection from the dead, which nobody else has since been able to duplicate. Or did he resurrect from the dead? That remains to be seen, examined, and proved. So, even the rabbis in the Talmud, and this is really important because, of course, the rabbis were vehemently against Jesus and also eventually ended up putting him to death by taking him to Pontius Pilate. But they judged him to be guilty of blasphemy, and they actually themselves admitted to the supernatural powers and the miracles demonstrated by Jesus and his disciples. However, according to them, this was only done through satanical means, and this was a frequent accusation towards Jesus, was that he was a false prophet and he only acted through sorcery, that he was the embodiment of Satanism. So, what about being a hypnotist? Wasn't it more likely that Jesus somehow magically hypnotized people as a master hypnotist? Well, a hypnotist can make someone believe that the water is wine and even suffer the effects as if they were swigging a cheap Bordeaux. But it couldn't account for his exorcisms, his transfiguration on Mount Tabor, and even his healing. Certainly, Lazarus might not have been really dead. He could have been in an induced trance and then raised back up 3 days later, somewhat smellier. And perhaps Jesus did indeed condition his disciples to hallucinate the resurrected appearances with certain prearranged cues, like when he broke bread at the supper. But as I said, it couldn't account for things like exorcisms or his transfiguration on Mount Tabor, and even a lot of the healings. However, it would explain the enigmatic reference to Jesus' inability when he went back to Nazareth to perform many miracles there, which was his hometown. He failed precisely where, as a hypnotist, we would most expect him to fail, amongst those who knew him best, those who had seen him grow up as an ordinary child. So he couldn't do many miracles there, and they were about to cast him off the cliff. Somehow he manages to slip away, but he certainly couldn't do much there. So let's see whether we can explain the following, however. They don't stand up to analysis. For example, when Jesus multiplied the bread and fish, there were 5,000 people present who he fed. How could he have hypnotized them all? Then, of course, the issue of hypnosis not generally working on skeptics and doubters. So how did he hypnotize his disbelieving cousin James? Because James didn't believe in him until actually seeing him resurrected. Saul of Tarsus, of course, the famous Orthodox Jew who was actually persecuting Christians. And then, of course, doubting Thomas, who wouldn't believe in the resurrected Christ until he actually was invited to place his fingers in Jesus's wounds. And only then did he believe. Hypnosis also wouldn't explain the empty tomb, right? Because the disciples could well have been hypnotized to believe the tomb was empty, but Jesus certainly couldn't have hypnotized the Pharisees and the Romans, and they would have gladly produced his body if it had been in the tomb. The fact that they didn't tells us the tomb truly was empty. There was the miracle at Cana, where, of course, he turned water into wine, but never addressed the wedding guests or the wedding the father of the bride. He didn't even suggest to the servants that the water had been turned into wine, and he certainly couldn't have hypnotized the guests who he never addressed. What about the healing of lepers? Well, that's truly an incredible miracle because leprosy was a very serious condition with extreme scabbing and scarring. There's no way they could have been instantaneously and totally healed. And that's not merely explicable by hypnosis, nor is the healing of a man with a shriveled hand, which was made whole again, which was quoted in Mark chapter 3. And even if someone were in a trance and merely thought their hand had been healed, eventually they would have found out the truth, because hypnosis doesn't last that long, and Jesus would then have been decried as a complete and utter fake. So the Gospels record all sorts of details about what Jesus said and did, but never once do they ever portray him as saying or doing anything that would suggest that he was a hypnotist. Finally, the last set of evidence in this part of the presentation, this video: does Jesus fulfill the attributes of God? What would God say and do if he truly was on earth? Well, here's Donald Carson, again, highly distinguished, one of the great thinkers in Christianity today, and amply qualified, as were and are all the others. Now, what did Jesus say or do that should convince us that he's divine? Was it his miracles? Well, funny enough, no, it isn't, because quite a lot of other people did miracles in the Old and New Testament, including Moses and his disciples before Jesus' death, because he gave them the power to do so when they went far and wide, and also after his death. So it is indicative, but it's not decisive. But one of the things he did, which is most striking, according to this gentleman, Mr. Carson, is forgiving sin. And here's why. Because if I do something to you, which is not good, you have the right to forgive me. But if someone else comes along and says, I forgive you, what kind of cheek is that? Which is what Jesus did several times, which really irritated the Pharisees. The only person who can say that sort of thing meaningfully, which is the point they made to him, is God himself. And that's why they accused him of absolute blasphemy. Because sin is primarily a sin against God and all his teachings and laws. That ends this section of the presentation, and we will soon, if you want to continue, part 4 will soon be there at your fingertips. Thank you very much for your attention.